The transport system that Germany carried into the Second World War emerged from interwar constraints rather than a clean-sheet design. Versailles limits, fiscal caution in the early 1930s, and uneven industrial recovery produced armed forces that mixed modern components with 19th-century habits. Army planning accepted a dual structure, mobile forces built around internal combustion engines, and a larger mass of infantry divisions that marched on foot and pulled their supply trains with horses. By September 1939, the Army mobilized hundreds of thousands of draft animals. By 1941 to 1943, German formations employed well over 2 million horses across all theaters, with peaks near 2.7 to 3.0 million when replacements and depots are counted. At the same time, Germany fielded a significant motor pool, but one that was smaller and more heterogeneous than those of industrial rivals. On the eve of operations in the east, the Wehrmacht controlled on the order of several 100,000 motor vehicles, including roughly 150,000 to 200,000 trucks in the invasion force, many drawn from civilian requisitions and foreign makes captured after 1939 to 1940. Doctrine reflected this blend. Operational art emphasized rapid decision and encirclement, but the staff system assumed railways would carry bulk tonnage to Army railheads, with roads bridging the last 50 to 150 kilometers between depots and divisions. Panzer and motorized divisions were intended to exploit gaps. Infantry divisions, largely horse-drawn, would seal pockets and hold lines. This concept economized on fuel and rubber. Commodities Germany could not expand at will. Synthetic plants could convert coal to motor spirit, but capacity and additive supply were finite. German truck production from 1939 to 1944 numbered in the hundreds of thousands, not millions. The United States alone produced more than 2 million trucks in the same period, creating a structural gap that planners tried to offset by strict economy and centralized allocation. Geography reinforced these choices. Central Europe possessed dense rail networks and a patchwork of paved and macadamized roads. Germany's modern highways measured in the low thousands of kilometers and were useful corridors, but did not reach deep into Eastern Europe. Beyond the pre-war Polish frontier, road quality declined. In European parts of the Soviet Union, hard-surfaced roads formed a thin lattice around major cities. Long rural stretches were gravel, crushed stone, or earth. Seasonal weather mattered. Dry summers baked ruts into corrugations. Autumn and spring rasputitsa transformed earth roads into mud, and winter created a hard surface broken by thaw cycles. German intelligence collected road and bridge data before 1941, but many estimates understated how often traffic would be forced onto single-lane causeways or detours. The transport mix also reflected institutional divides. The Army's quartermaster branch prioritized standardization, yet procurement after victories in 1939 to 1940 absorbed captured vehicles from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Czechoslovakia. Field parks in 1941 contained dozens of makes, from German 3-ton types to French 2.5-ton chassis and Czech light trucks. This variety complicated spare parts inventories and repair schooling. Horse services faced different bottlenecks: fodder supply, shoeing, and veterinary care. A single infantry division might require tens of tons of oats and hay per day for thousands of animals, delivered by the same roads and rail lines needed for fuel and ammunition. The trade-off was persistent. Horses consumed local biomass, but slowed road columns. Trucks increased speed and payload, but drew on fuel and maintenance that Germany could not expand without limit. Comparative data sharpened the context. In 1939, Germany mobilized approximately 100 to 120 divisions, of which fewer than 20 were fully motorized or armored. By June 1941, the Osttier deployed roughly 150 to 155 divisions for Barbarossa. Panzer and motorized formations numbered in the low 30s, while over 100 infantry divisions remained horse-drawn. The Red Army, reorganizing after 1937 to 1941 purges and equipment disruptions, fielded large mechanized formations on paper, but relied heavily on rail and animal traction in rear services. Later, wartime inflows would change the Soviet truck picture, but in mid-1941, Both sides depended on railheads and short-haul road movement to sustain combat. In the West, British and Commonwealth forces pursued higher motorization ratios within smaller field armies, leaning on imperial shipping and American industry. The United States built a logistics base premised on motor transport from the outset. Its standard 2.5-ton cargo truck established a scale that Germany could not match. Public sentiment and propaganda highlighted tanks, aircraft, and new highways, shaping external perceptions of a fully mechanized force. Intelligence estimates within European capitals often mirrored that image, assuming that German operational reach derived from nationwide motorization. In practice, the road network's limitations, the mixed vehicle park, and the horse share formed the hidden scaffolding of German movement. Commanders planned maneuvers with march tables that integrated wagon columns, veterinary halts, and road discipline alongside fuel dumps and tire consumption. The staff college tradition handled such arithmetic well on paper, but it required favorable rail schedules, workable roads, and reliable resupply to function at scale. Economic policy framed the same realities in different terms. Rubber imports declined after 1939. Synthetic Buna programs lagged behind demand. Fuel balances depended on Romanian deliveries and domestic synthesis. Truck output competed with armored fighting vehicle programs and with aircraft engines for alloy steels and machining hours. Civilian trucking firms provided a reserve, but every requisition reduced domestic haulage for coal, food, and construction. The result was a continual negotiation between front and home front, mediated by the Armaments Ministry and the Transport Ministry, over how many trucks could be spared, how many horses could be procured without disrupting agriculture, and how far road maintenance resources could be stretched. Preconditions in the East added one more layer: distances from German staging areas to objectives like Leningrad, Moscow, and the Dnieper Basin measured hundreds to over 1,000 kilometers. Rail gauge changes forced delays as lines were converted or transshipment yards improvised. Once beyond the railhead, the last mile problem multiplied. Every extra kilometer of road between depots and divisions increased the truck fleet needed to deliver a fixed daily tonnage, or, in horse terms, expanded the fodder burden that itself consumed transport capacity. The German command entered 1941, aware of these arithmetic constraints, yet optimistic that short, decisive operations would keep transport chains within manageable ranges. The starting position, therefore, combined ambition, scarcity, and a transport mix that would shape pace and reach from the first week of war. War opened with movement schedules rather than victory parades. In September 1939, the German army crossed into Poland with roughly 1.5 to 1.8 million men organized in about 60 divisions under army groups north and south, including 6 panzer divisions and 4 light divisions. Their columns revealed the transport mix plainly: panzer brigades and motorized infantry on fuel and rubber at the front of march tables, long files of horse-drawn supply vehicles behind, carrying rations, 7.92 millimeter ammunition, and artillery shells for field pieces like the 10.5 centimeter LEFH-18. Mobilization orders at home districts had already requisitioned civilian lorries and some 500,000 horses. Railways lifted the bulk of forces to forward to training points on standard gauge lines. From there, the last 50 to 120 kilometers fell to roads, with quartermasters assigning daily road spaces by unit and hour to prevent blockages. On the Polish side, the opening phase also ran through rail timetables. The Polish state railways completed partial mobilization in late August, moving army depots and formations toward the frontier while evacuating state assets east. Polish field armies, Pomorze, Poznan, Lodz, Krakow, Prusy, Modlin, and Karpaty, relied on a narrower motor pool with horse traction dominant in divisional services. Bridges over the Vistula and San were prepared for demolition to slow German advances and to force heavier supply convoys onto detours. Civilians saw the same infrastructure from a different angle: crowded stations, queues of carts, and the priority trains carrying grain, coal, and wounded. The German command architecture placed the transport burden with the quartermaster general at the army level, and with corps and division supply officers on the march. Each infantry division's baggage and ammunition columns ran to hundreds of wagons and carts, typically requiring 2 to 3 parallel road axes if available. Motor transport battalions allocated 3-ton and 4.5-ton trucks to shuttle between railheads and forward refilling points. In the first week, paved and macadamized sections in Silesia and Pomerania allowed rapid turnarounds. Farther east, gravel and earth roads reduced average daily truck cycles, and horse-drawn trains dropped to 25 to 35 kilometers per day, depending on gradients and weather. The Wehrmacht compensated with traffic control detachments, bridge classification signs, and field workshops, but every kilometer beyond the railhead reduced effective tonnage delivered to regiments at contact. The French and British watched these movements closely. The British Expeditionary Force landing in France from September 1939 built a logistics base around motor transport companies of the Royal Army Service Corps, each equipped with standardized 30 CWT and 3-ton trucks. French planning rested on dense rail networks and a comparatively good lattice of national roads radiating from Paris. Divisional services use both lorries and animal traction, depending on formation type. Early Allied intelligence reports interpreted German speed in Poland as proof of nationwide motorization. German records show a different mechanism: focused motor transport for the spearheads, heavy dependence on rail and horses for the mass, and a short campaign that kept road haul distances within workable ranges. The 1940 campaign in the West repeated the pattern on a larger scale. On May 10, 1940, Germany opened operations with Army Groups A, B, and C, fielding about 136 divisions, including 10 panzer divisions and 6 motorized infantry divisions. Panzer Corps, such as 19th under Heinz Guderian and 41st under Georg Reinhardt, were organized to cross the Meuse quickly and drive toward the Channel. Their sustainment rested on fuel echelons of mixed trucks and captured French civilian tankers pressed into service once available. Behind them, infantry corps with horse-drawn artillery and baggage closed encirclements and held river lines. The Ardennes road net imposed a hard constraint. Narrow defiles, limited bypasses, and bridge load classifications dictated march serials down to battalion level. German traffic regulators prioritized fuel columns and bridging trains. Veterinary detachments established rest points for thousands of draft animals whose fodder also consumed transport space. French armies, including 1st and 7th Armées on the northern flank and 2nd and 9th Armées in the Ardennes sector, mobilized with considerable numbers of trucks, but with a heterogeneous park that included multiple makes and payload classes. Strategic rail redeployments during the Dial Plan, moving units toward the Netherlands and central Belgium, functioned as designed yet tactical road congestion in the Meuse sectors narrowed options once German crossings succeeded. The British Expeditionary Force maintained motorized divisional services and corps roadheads, but when front lines moved faster than expected, the distance from railheads to forward units grew by tens of kilometers in a matter of days, reducing daily truck turnarounds. Civilians experienced detours, requisitions, and fuel rationing that mirrored military priorities. Prefectures balanced local food deliveries against army demands for road space. Captures in 1940 expanded the German motor pool, but at a cost. By June, field parks contained French 2.5-ton and 3.5-ton trucks, Belgian and Dutch light lorries, and fuel tankers of assorted fittings. This increased available payload, but multiplied part numbers. Workshops improvised, cannibalizing vehicles to keep more rolling. Horse services faced different arithmetic. A corps might field 15,000 to 20,000 animals. Each required several kilograms of oats and hay per day. Fodder trains followed the same roads that fuel convoys needed, making road discipline as critical as battlefield command. In the north, Norway offered a separate case study. Operation Weserübung in April 1940 leveraged sea lift and small motor echelons, but once ashore, German units used local roads of limited bearing capacity and accepted a higher proportion of animal and human portage in mountainous sectors. The Royal Navy's interdiction of coastal shipping shortened German supply lines only when ports were secured. Until then, airlift and coastal craft carried fuel and ammunition in irregular pulses. Across these early operations, every side encountered versions of the same constraint. Railways could position armies, but roads, horses, and trucks determined the tempo once contact began. By June 1940, the consequences of this mix were visible at Dunkirk. German armored and motorized units that had driven to the coast needed refuel, tire changes, and depot replenishment. Infantry divisions advancing on foot closed the last segments more slowly. British and French commanders organized perimeter defenses and prioritized evacuation traffic through the port. The Royal Navy and Merchant Marine provided lift, but movement from assembly areas to the beaches still depended on roads and lorries under air attack. In this sense, the opening phase across Poland, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and France displayed a consistent logic. Rapid operational moves were feasible when railheads sat close, roads could be regulated, and motor transport was concentrated. Where distances lengthened, surfaces degraded, or repair capacity lagged, horse-drawn echelons and mixed truck parks imposed a ceiling, on pace and reach, that high command decisions could not simply declare away. Planning for the 1941 campaign fixed objectives in operational terms, but translated them into transport arithmetic. The German High Command framed goals for army groups north, center, and south, Leningrad, Moscow, and the Ukraine, with the expectation that decisive defeat would occur within weeks. Staff tables translated those aims into daily lift. Railways would carry bulk tonnage to forward railheads, while roads, horses, and trucks would close the last segment. Pre-invasion estimates set the combined daily requirement for the Eastern Theater in the range of 20,000 to 30,000 tons delivered to armies, with Army Group Center absorbing the largest share during the drive on Smolensk and Moscow. Achieving that flow depended on three variables the planners could only partially control: the pace of broad-gauge conversion, the condition of roads beyond the old Polish frontier, and the availability of serviceable trucks with fuel and tires. Railway engineers and operating battalions received targets for gauge change from 1,524 millimeters to 1,435 millimeters and for reopening yards and bridges. Units calculated conversion rates in tens of kilometers per day per line under permissive conditions, less when bridges required repair. The first railheads were expected to sit 100 to 200 kilometers behind the Panzer spearheads. As the front advanced, that gap would widen until new railheads caught up. Road haul bridged that gap. Quartermasters modeled truck cycles using 3-ton and 4.5-ton payload classes, average road speeds of 25 to 35 kilometers per hour on improved surfaces, and one round trip per day when distances remained under 150 kilometers. Assuming 70 to 80% availability to account for breakdowns and maintenance, a motor transport battalion of 500 trucks could lift roughly 1,000 to 1,800 tons per day in short-haul conditions. The same unit's output fell sharply when road distance doubled or when weather reduced speeds. Horse-drawn columns were built into the same tables for divisional echelons. A typical infantry division fielded thousands of animals, each consuming 8 to 10 kilograms of fodder per day, which itself had to be hauled forward. Veterinary services, farriers, and fodder depots were thus integral parts of the plan, not afterthoughts. Fuel and rubber policy sat upstream of every road calculation. Petroleum balance sheets combined Romanian crude, domestic synthesis, and stocks held by depots. To move panzer groups at operational tempo, planners allocated priority fuel columns that shadowed armored spearheads at fixed intervals. Tire wear forecasts assumed several hundred kilometers of movement per month on mixed surfaces. Rubber import shortfalls compelled strict driving discipline and reduced non-essential mileage. The Army accepted a heterogeneous truck park after 1940, German makes, augmented by French, Belgian, Dutch, and Czech vehicles, while acknowledging the spare parts burden this imposed. Workshops received parts lists measured in the thousands of line items, and training circulars instructed mechanics to cannibalize damaged vehicles to maintain a higher percentage of runners at the front. The staff system's mitigation was centralization. Field parks and corps-level motor transport battalions acted as reservoirs that could be surged to critical axes. The Soviet side entered 1941 with different premises and constraints. Strategic objectives included defensive industry in the northwest and Ukraine, preservation of rail junctions, and the capacity for counteroffensive once mobilization matured. Red Army sustainment relied on state railways for long-haul movement, with divisional road echelons using a mix of trucks and animal traction. Pre-war truck inventories included Soviet makes in 1.5 to 3-ton classes and lighter half-ton vehicles. Production disruptions in 1940 to 1941 and the need to redistribute factories hindered standardization. Staff guidance emphasized railheads as the backbone, with road transport assigned to forward distribution and unit resupply. Bridge demolition plans and scorched earth provisions anticipated retreat, aiming to lengthen German road hauls and increase consumption per ton delivered. Later inflows of foreign trucks would alter this balance, but at the planning stage in June 1941, Soviet logisticians assumed limited motor lift in forward zones and prioritized rail movement to operational groupings around key cities and river lines. German march tables integrated traffic control into the operational plan. Corps and Army traffic regulators issued road space assignments by hour and unit, with bridge classification charts governing axle loads. Bridge trains and pioneer battalions moved with the first waves to ensure crossings for fuel and ammunition. The operational map translated into corridors, a few all-weather roads and numerous secondary routes of gravel or earth. In fine weather, dust reduced engine life and filtered fuel systems. In rain, road capacity fell as vehicles bogged, increasing cycle time and reducing daily delivered tonnage. The plan's margin assumed a short campaign so that the cumulative effect of wear, tire loss, and road degradation would not reach a critical threshold before decisive battles concluded. May's estimation appeared where arithmetic met geography. Staff assumptions for road quality east of the Bug and Niemen often used optimistic averages derived from main routes. Once columns dispersed to lateral or feeder roads, average speeds and payloads dropped, especially for heavier tankers and 4.5-ton trucks. Horse echelons were resilient to surface damage but required rest, shoeing, and fodder delivered over the same roads. Every additional kilometer between railhead and forward refilling point increased the number of trucks needed in the shuttle to maintain a fixed daily flow. A 50-kilometer extension might demand hundreds of extra truck kilometers, magnifying fuel use and maintenance. When two Panzer Corps advanced on divergent axes, the transport reserve could not support both at full tempo, unless railheads advanced synchronously, forcing priority decisions at army or theater level. Propaganda framed these preparations through images of tanks on new highways and columns of standardized lorries under national flags. Internally, directives stressed conservation, avoid unnecessary movement, maintain strict march intervals, and protect bridges and roadbeds from overloading. Training memoranda warned that tactical success without road discipline would reduce operational reach within days. Soviet public messaging emphasized rail mobilization and defense of cities, while rear services planned evacuation schedules for factories and depots by rail first, road second. Both sides thus entered the campaign with clear strategic goals expressed in movement problems. The German concept sought rapid envelopment, predicated on concentrated motor lift and temporary substitution of roads for incomplete rail conversion. The Soviet concept sought depth and endurance, predicated on rail mass and the deliberate use of bridge demolition and distance to erode an opponent's last-mile capacity. The collision of these plans would test whether road networks, horses, and trucks could carry intentions across hundreds of kilometers at the required pace. Combat converted plans into measured distances and depleted inventories. On 22 June 1941, Army Group North, Center, and South crossed the frontier with Panzer Groups leading and infantry armies following. Panzer Group E3 and Panzergruppe II on the central axis moved toward Vilnius, Minsk, and the Berezina. Panzergruppe IV advanced through the Baltic states. Panzergruppe I drove into western Ukraine. The first week produced deep penetrations, but the pace of the road echelons and the availability of fuel determined how long armored spearheads could remain ahead of their own supply base. German bridge trains threw pontoons over the Niemen and Bug within hours. Soviet demolition parties destroyed multiple fixed crossings on tributaries of the Dwina and Dnieper, diverting heavy traffic onto single-lane bypasses. Every detour extended the shuttle distances for fuel and ammunition, cutting daily delivered tonnage at the same time as demand rose. Around Bialystok and Minsk, encirclement formed between late June and early July, when infantry corps closed gaps behind the panzer groups. Army Group Center reported large captures in men and materiel as the ring tightened west of the Berezina. Soviet records show separate armies fighting to break out in segments toward the east. German road columns feeding this operation ran from railheads still inside former Polish territory to forward refilling points near Slonim and Baranovichi. The average round trip for a truck company rose above 200 kilometers by the time the Minsk pocket collapsed in early July, reducing the number of trips each vehicle could complete per day. Horse-drawn divisional trains moved at 25 to 35 kilometers per day and required frequent halts for watering and shoeing. Veterinary companies established points along main supply routes, while fuel echelons prioritized tanker movement at night to reduce congestion and exposure to air attack. Further north, Army Group North advanced through Kaunas and Daugavpils toward the Luga line. The Baltic road grid contained paved segments between major towns, but long gravel or earth stretches between them. Panzergruppe IV's exploitation depended on a small number of bridges over the western Dvina. Once crossings were secured, traffic regulators allocated road space to fuel tankers, bridging equipment, and 3-ton cargo trucks in fixed ratios. Soviet Northwestern Front moved reserves by rail into the Luga defensive belt and used local road columns and horse carts to feed units assembling near Leningrad's approaches. The Luftwaffe attacked rail nodes at Dnipro, Pskov, and Ostrov to delay these movements. Where junctions remained operational, Soviet trains delivered ammunition and evacuees from forward depots, compressing schedules as tracks filled in both directions. In Ukraine, Panzergruppe I broke through in the Lutsk-Rivne-Brody sector in late June. The road net on this axis offered more lateral routes but varied bearing capacity. Corps engineers graded shoulders and reinforced culverts for heavy fuel tankers. Army Group South's rail conversion lagged the central sector, requiring longer motor shuttles from railheads near Kovel, Vlodzimierz, and later Shepetovka. Soviet Southwestern Front, including 5th and 6th Armies, counterattacked with mechanized corps around Dubno. Large formations moved by road and consumed fuel at rates that exceeded local deliveries, forcing withdrawals to refuel and reorganize. Civilians on both sides experienced the same roads under different constraints. Columns of evacuees, requisitioned carts, and military convoys competing for narrow pavements and ferries. Soviet authorities began evacuating factories and food stocks by rail from Lutsk, Rovno, and later Kiev, while local administrations imposed traffic controls to keep arterial roads open for military movement. The first sustained friction emerged from tire and engine wear. Dust on unimproved roads clogged fuel and air systems. Maintenance companies reported increased filter replacement and higher rates of breakdown. Availability in some truck battalions fell from pre-invasion targets above 80% to near 60% within weeks, as vehicles awaited parts or required tire changes. Heterogeneous fleets acquired in 1940 complicated this repair picture. French and Dutch trucks required different tires, bearings, and electrical components than German makes. Workshops cannibalized damaged vehicles to maintain a larger number of runners. In horse services, casualties from exhaustion and hoof damage accumulated, increasing the load on veterinary stations and reducing wagon lift until remounts arrived. Soviet road echelons faced parallel difficulties. Mechanized corps mobilized with incomplete truck complements and dispersed to meet German penetrations. Where railheads were lost, forward units drew on local requisitioning of horses and carts to move ammunition and food. Bridge demolitions slowed German pursuit, but also complicated Soviet redistributions. Where roads converged on limited crossings, traffic jams exposed both sides to air attack and delayed medical evacuation. The Red Army's reliance on rail remained a strength where double-track mains stayed open, allowing concentrated counterattacks to assemble near river lines. When junctions were cut, forward units experienced shortfalls in artillery ammunition and fuel that reduced operational endurance. By mid-July, the Smolensk sector illustrated how transport governed tempo. Panzergruppe 3 and 2 reached the Dnieper and found crossings damaged or insufficient for sustained heavy traffic. Temporary bridges carried a fraction of the capacity of destroyed permanent spans. The gap from railhead to forward refilling points increased toward 250 to 300 kilometers on some axes, reducing the daily number of round trips per truck. German staffs responded by establishing intermediate depots and by restricting non-essential movement to preserve tires and fuel. Army Group Center concentrated motor transport on 2 or 3 corridors, leaving secondary axes to horse-drawn columns that could traverse damaged surfaces at lower speeds. Unexpected outcomes followed from this arithmetic. Rapid encirclements yielded large captures, but the road haul burden to feed advanced spearheads and the infantry following them limited immediate exploitation toward deeper objectives. Localized counterattacks forced diversions that absorbed truck cycles, otherwise earmarked for forward fuel delivery. In the north, delays along the Luga line bought time for the defense of Leningrad. In the south, contested crossings on the southern Bug and the Dnieper extended schedules and kept large Soviet forces intact east of the river. On all axes, the first engagements showed a consistent pattern. Decisive movement required synchronized progress of rail conversion and road haul. When one lagged, the other could not compensate without reducing pace. Civilian life adapted to these constraints as much as military formations did. Municipal authorities in occupied towns rationed road space, directed fodder procurement, and organized labor for bridge and road repair under military supervision. Refugee flows shifted onto side roads to clear main supply routes, but this increased time to reach rail evacuation points. In Soviet territory, evacuation orders assigned factories rail priorities, followed by food stocks and hospitals. Road columns filled the gap where trains were unavailable. The opening engagements thus created a broad front in which rails positioned armies, but roads, horses, and trucks decided how fast combat power could arrive, how long it could be sustained, and how quickly a success could be turned into a further advance. The summer advance turned into a contest against distance and wear. After the fall of Minsk in early July 1941, German headquarters shifted effort toward Smolensk, while holding open options for Leningrad and Ukraine. Panzergruppe 3 pushed through Vitebsk toward Yartsevo. Panzergruppe 2 swung through Mogilev and Roslavel. The encirclement battles around Smolensk from mid-July to early August produced large captures, yet every kilometer gained lengthened the road shuttle from railheads still inside former Poland. Truck companies that had completed 1 round trip per day in June now averaged 1 every 2 days on 300-kilometer circuits. Availability in some motor transport battalions fell below 60% as engines required overhaul and tires wore thin on crushed stone and corduroy. Horse echelons kept moving, but at a fixed pace, their fodder demands rising with distance. German engineers built bypasses and temporary bridges, but each carried less load than destroyed fixed spans, constraining the flow of tankers and heavy ammunition. Soviet formations experienced crisis and adaptation simultaneously. Western Front and Reserve Front reformed east of Smolensk, using rail lines through Vyazma and Rzhev to bring rifle divisions and artillery into position. Where rails remained intact, the Red Army could reposition thousands of men in hours. Where junctions were damaged, road columns of mixed trucks and requisitioned carts bridged the gap. The front stabilized in segments because transport limited exploitation. German spearheads outran their supply base, while Soviet defenders used distance and rail mobility to concentrate on chosen axes. Civilians became part of the same movement system. Evacuation trains carrying industrial equipment rolled east from Dnepropetrovsk, Kharkov, and Leningrad. Food stocks and hospitals followed in priority order, with roads filling the difference where rail capacity was insufficient. In the north, the approach to Leningrad compressed road and rail networks into a few corridors. Army Group North reached the Luga line in July. Repeated attacks and counterattacks consumed ammunition faster than motor shuttles could replenish from railheads around Pskov and Dino. The Soviet side moved reserve armies by rail into the city's approaches and established lake and river barge routes for redundancy. German traffic regulators gave priority to fuel and bridging trains, but the single-threaded nature of the network imposed a ceiling on daily lift. When the front shifted toward Mumga and Schlisselburg in August and September, each destroyed bridge forced days of detours for tanker columns. The siege that followed depended as much on rail interdiction and road access as on artillery. For both sides, lake transport and winter ice roads would later alter the balance. But in late summer, the capacity of a handful of roads determined the tempo of operations north of Novgorod. On the central axis, the decision to launch Operation Typhoon in late September codified a high-risk transport plan. Army Group Center massed Panzergruppe 2 and 3, supported by infantry armies, to strike Vyazma and Bryansk. The objective was operational collapse of Soviet defenses west of Moscow. To make it possible, the quartermaster system concentrated fuel for days, diverting motor transport from secondary sectors and imposing strict driving bans outside essential movements. Panzer units received additional tankers and priority at depots, but the rail net behind them had not fully converted to standard gauge, and road surfaces degraded under traffic. The encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk in early October trapped large Soviet forces. However, the same weather front that slowed retreating columns also slowed supply. Rain turned earth roads into mud. Average truck speed fell below 15 kilometers per hour in stretches. Recovery vehicles worked continuously to pull bogged lorries off the main axes. Horse-drawn trains continued to move, but required doubled teams and frequent rest, increasing fodder consumption at the moment when road capacity for fodder delivery was least available. South of the Pripyat marshes, the picture was mixed. Army Group South and its allied formations executed a large encirclement at Kiev in September, capturing significant personnel and equipment. The operation concentrated motor transport for weeks along the Dnieper crossings and the Poltava axis. Once completed, forward movement toward Kharkov and the Donets Basin confronted railheads still far to the west. Soviet southwestern and southern fronts used rail to move reserves from the left bank of the Dnieper and scattered industrial sites eastward. Bridges over the Dnieper and its tributaries were principal targets for both sides. Each successful demolition imposed a new series of ferry sites and pontoon bridges that reduced throughput and stressed traffic control. Resource balances became visible in daily orders. Fuel issuance tables showed stocks declining with each long-haul shuttle. In October, inventories at some forward depots supported only a few days of full operations. Command directed pauses to rebuild fuel and ammunition for the next phase. Rubber shortages manifested in tire rationing and in limits on non-essential driving. The heterogeneous fleet captured in 1940 imposed a maintenance tax. A workshop that could keep 200 standardized trucks running might manage 150 when parts had to be matched across French, Dutch, and Czech makes. Cannibalization kept more vehicles rolling, but the pool of donor trucks shrank as attrition mounted. For horses, the crisis appeared as rising wastage from exhaustion and disease. Veterinary companies triaged cases, and remount deliveries lagged the rate of loss. In some divisions, wagon lift declined by double-digit percentages within weeks, forcing greater reliance on limited motor capacity for critical supplies. Political calculations interacted with transport realities. German leadership pressed for decisive results before winter, accepting risk that rail conversion and road repair could not fully mitigate. Soviet leadership prioritized holding key rail nodes and river lines, betting that time and depth would degrade German last-mile capacity. International assistance remained at the level of policy and planning. Agreements for external supply existed, but large-scale truck deliveries to the Soviet side were not yet present at the front. Inside both systems, propaganda emphasized resilience while staff memoranda highlighted constraints, axle load limits on bridges, road classifications, and the arithmetic of truck cycles under mud conditions. Civilian experience mapped onto the same constraints. Food distribution in occupied cities followed the main supply routes used by armies, competing for road space and truck time. In besieged or contested zones, ration scales depended on rail access. When rails were cut, road columns and rivercraft could not replace the tonnage. Evacuations moved in waves that coincided with military traffic lulls, then paused when offensives resumed. Road repair drew on local labor. Culverts, drainage, and gravel pits became strategic assets as much as depots and airfields. By early November, the campaign entered a phase where logistics and weather dictated outcomes as much as battlefield maneuver. German formations prepared for a renewed push on Moscow with narrowed fuel margins and reduced truck availability. Soviet defenders shortened their supply lines as fronts stabilized closer to large rail hubs. Partisan activity began to impose additional friction on roads and rails, expanding the number of guards and patrols needed to secure lines of communication. The crisis of escalation thus had a consistent shape across sectors. Road networks strained under traffic and weather. Motor transport wore down. Horse traction reached physiological limits, and rail conversion could not eliminate the long last-mile shuttles fast enough. Every operational choice, where to attack, when to pause, which axis to prioritize, reflected that arithmetic. Late 1941 marked the moment when operations reached their maximum intensity, while transport margins narrowed to the thinnest tolerances. After the encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk in early October, Army Group Center massed for the final approach to Moscow. Panzergruppe II, redesignated 2nd Panzer Army in October, drove north from Orel toward Tula. Panzergruppe III, later 3rd Panzer Army, advanced via Kalinin and Klin. 4th Panzer Group came in from the northwest. Infantry armies followed on foot, with horse-drawn artillery and baggage trains. The plan assumed several days of high-speed exploitation before weather and wear imposed a pause. Instead, rain and then frost turned the last-mile shuttle into the principal contest. Average road speeds dropped, maintenance cycles lengthened. Tanker turnarounds halved when bridges and culverts failed under repeated loads. Fuel stocks at forward depots fluctuated between a few days and a week of operations. Divisional orders restricted non-essential movement and concentrated remaining truck capacity on fuel and ammunition for armored spearheads. Soviet fronts defending Moscow shortened their supply lines as fighting moved closer to major rail hubs. Kalinin, Moscow, and Gorky lines brought rifle divisions, artillery, and anti-tank regiments forward in nightly schedules. Where rails were cut by air attack or partisan action, road echelons used sledges and trucks to bridge gaps of tens of kilometers from reserve depots to rifle corps sectors. Factory evacuations had shifted east through the summer, but local enterprises around the capital produced small quantities of tires, lubricants, and winter clothing that directly affected march endurance. Command posts balanced the distribution of fuel between tank brigades needed for counterattacks and motor transport companies that sustained the line. Compared with June, the Soviet motor pool remained limited, yet proximity to rail nodes reduced the daily road haul requirement to front units, a structural advantage once the front stabilized. On the German side, cold weather imposed a second layer of constraints. Winterized lubricants and antifreeze were in short supply in many units. Starting engines required preheating. Idling to prevent stalls consumed fuel needed at the front. Rubber stiffened and cracked. Tire failures increased on corduroy and frozen ruts. Workshops moved outdoors when tents could not accommodate vehicles with frozen suspensions, and repair times doubled for tasks that had taken hours in summer. Horse traction faced a different curve. As temperatures fell, nutritional requirements rose. Fodder deliveries, already competing with fuel for road space, lagged demand. Veterinary detachments reported higher losses from exposure and exhaustion. Wagon lift declined as teams were reduced and animals rotated to rest. Where rails advanced, this loss could be masked. Where rails lagged, the decline in horse lift directly reduced daily tonnage to divisional dumps. The siege of Leningrad displayed the same arithmetic in a fixed theater. By September, the city was isolated by land. For the defenders, lake and river routes became the decisive supplement to short road hauls. In autumn, barges moved food and ammunition across Lake Ladoga under air and artillery threat. With the freeze, an ice road opened that could carry truck convoys. Early capacity measured in hundreds of tons per day grew as ice thickened and road maintenance improved, supported by traffic control, refueling points, and repair sheds on the ice margins. For the besieging forces, road access to the front depended on a few corridors through poor terrain. Fuel and ammunition for artillery had to move along narrow routes with limited bridge capacity. The same scarcity that constrained offensive operations on the Moscow axis thus limited sustained pressure on the northern siege lines, shaping the intensity and timing of bombardments and local attacks. Farther south, the Rostov sector illustrated how transport could invert local superiority. After the Kiev Encirclement, German formations pushed toward the Donets Basin and Rostov in October and November. Rail conversion lagged the advance. Crossings over the Manik and Don were few and often temporary. As the road gap from railhead to forward depots passed 200 to 300 kilometers, daily delivered tonnage by truck declined despite committed motor battalions. Soviet Southern Front, operating closer to railheads east of the Don and drawing on local animal traction, mounted counterattacks that forced withdrawals from Rostov at the end of November. The geographic facts were straightforward. The side able to keep roads supplied from nearby rails could concentrate faster and sustain longer, even with fewer trucks. Command decisions during this period were made with explicit reference to transport figures. Army Group Center issued orders limiting tank use to axes where fuel columns could be guaranteed. Corps commanders submitted daily reports on truck availability and tire stocks alongside casualty and ammunition returns. Requests for replacement vehicles ran up against production and repair capacity in the rear. Cannibalization kept a percentage of vehicles running, but reduced the overall pool as winter progressed. On the Soviet side, Stavka prioritized allocation of locomotives and wagons to sectors where counteroffensives were planned, accepting shortages elsewhere. New truck deliveries from domestic factories were limited, so road echelons used repairable older chassis and increased horse use in short-haul segments, especially where snow packed into serviceable sledging routes. Civilian conditions reflected the same transport stresses. In occupied towns, food distribution depended on army supply corridors. When military columns had priority, municipal deliveries slowed and ration scales were adjusted. In the capital region, urban services coordinated with rail yards to unload at night and push supplies by truck to district depots before dawn, freeing road space for military use during daylight. Winter clothing and fuel for heating moved by the same roads that carried ammunition and medical evacuations. In besieged zones, the difference between rail access and reliance on road alone translated into measurable caloric intake per person. The opening of reliable ice routes across lakes or rivers altered these figures within days. By early December, the German advance on Moscow lost momentum as the combined effects of distance, weather, and attrition outweighed local tactical gains. Soviet counteroffensives began on 5 to 6 December along a wide arc from Kalinin to Tula. Their immediate enablers were shorter supply lines to major railheads and the ability to move reserves laterally by rail within the capital region, then complete the last segment by road. German withdrawals required road discipline under pressure. Traffic control units reversed one-way schemes to move artillery and supply trains rearward while keeping lanes open for rearguard infantry. Where bridges were insufficient, pioneer units laid additional pontoons under freezing conditions, further consuming transport resources. The peak of the campaign thus appeared not as a single battle, but as the moment when both systems committed their maximum road, horse, and truck capacity against the constraints of winter and distance, with outcomes determined by how closely rails could be brought to the line and how efficiently the last-mile shuttle could be sustained. Adaptation, in 1942, began with a sober reckoning of limits. After the winter counteroffensive, German armies redefined tempo as a function of what roads and traction could bear. Field orders introduced stricter march discipline, mandatory rest cycles for draft animals, and reduced speed limits for overloaded trucks on frozen or rutted surfaces. 2nd Panzer Army shifted some fuel and ammunition to forward dumps near Orel and Kursk to shorten the last leg. Army Group North organized staggered delivery windows on the Emja corridor to prevent queues of tankers before damaged bridges. Workshops rewrote priorities from cosmetic repair to functional availability. Engines, tires, and braking systems took precedence over bodywork, and cannibalization became a formal method, logged by chassis number to monitor the shrinking pool. Across the Ostfront, engineers renewed corduroy laying on marsh sections and widened causeways using local timber under pioneer supervision, trading construction time for predictable cycles later. Institutional changes followed. In February 1942, Albert Speer assumed armaments oversight and pushed standardization within existing constraints. Motor transport battalions concentrated around fewer payload classes where possible, pairing 3-ton and 4.5-ton trucks to match bridge ratings and axle loads. The Army introduced half-track trucks, such as the Sti KF-Zil, 3 Maltier to cope with mud on feeder roads, sacrificing speed on pavement for traction in soft ground. Veterinary services received expanded depots of shoes and antiseptics. Farrier schools near the front trained replacements to reduce wastage from hoof injuries. Traffic control units formalized one-way circuits on narrow routes, posting time-based tables by regiment and column type, so fuel tankers, ammunition lorries, and horse wagons would not meet head-on at culverts. The Soviet side adapted on a broader industrial and geographic canvas. Factory evacuations completed through winter allowed resumed production of trucks and spares in the Volga and Urals regions. Stavka directives concentrated rail-borne reserves at hubs like Voronezh and Stalingrad, with road echelons tasked only with the final segment. Foreign deliveries began to shape the forward picture. Trucks from overseas reached Arkhangelsk and Murmansk on Arctic convoys and entered via the Persian corridor through Iran, with throughput increasing as port and rail capacity expanded. Models such as the Studebaker 2.5-ton and the GMC 2.5-ton joined Soviet types, and their standardized parts simplified repair at field parks. Where rails approached the front, rifle divisions received scheduled replenishment by night. Where rails were cut, armies resorted to requisitioned horses for short-haul movement, restoring lift at a cost in speed. Partisan activity matured into sustained interdiction. Along the Smolensk land bridge, German Siegerungs divisions and police regiments guarded bridges, culverts, and signal boxes. Bridge classification signs now shared posts with mine warning boards. When rails were interdicted, road traffic spiked and congestion followed. Corps commanders created rapid repair groups for rails and roads, assigning them motor priority even over some artillery columns. The Soviet command built a complementary system of rail ambush and road cutting, targeting bridges that forced long detours for German supply. Civilians lived within this contest. Work details gathered cordwood and gravel to reinforce approaches to damaged crossings. Village carts hauled sleepers and rails to repair sites under military orders. In rear area towns, ration scales varied with the success of each night's convoy. Summer planning for 1942 translated adaptation into new operational geometry. Case Blue proposed a drive from Kursk and Kharkov toward the Don, the Donets Basin, and the Caucasus oil fields. Quartermasters evaluated road maps and river crossings south of Voronezh and along the lower Don, identifying gaps where permanent bridges did not exist. Rail conversion brigades targeted lines running to Voroshilovgrad and Stalingrad, but their schedule lagged the tempo envisioned for panzer armies. To compensate, depots were stepped forward in tiers, railheads in the rear, intermediate dumps at the limit of motor shuttles, and forward refilling points near planned crossings. The arithmetic was explicit. A 3-ton truck moving 200 kilometers round trip at summer speeds could complete 1 cycle daily if road discipline held. Double the distance or halve the speed in dust or mud, and delivered tonnage fell below operational demand. Fodder columns were recalculated to reflect steppe conditions, where local forage was limited. Wagon teams received ration supplements that consumed road capacity otherwise available for fuel. Opposing adaptations intersected around the same nodes. At Kharkov in May 1942, German counteroffensives exploited shorter road legs on prepared axes, while Soviet armies extended their own supply lines during an offensive and encountered shortages of artillery ammunition and fuel once railheads were threatened. The lesson, recorded in both command systems, was that offensive risk increased non-linearly when road legs exceeded the daily cycle of a motor battalion. Later that summer, on the approach to Stalingrad, panzer and motorized divisions surged ahead under concentrated fuel allocation. Infantry corps followed with horse-drawn artillery and bridge trains. When the Don crossings narrowed to a few ferry and pontoon sites, tanker waiting times lengthened. Traffic control could not compress physics, and artillery stocks at the front fluctuated by battery as bridges were rationed by time slot and axle load. At the same time, Allied theaters demonstrated different balances. In North Africa, British 8th Army and later U.S. forces operated in sparsely populated areas with few railways, relying on long motor hauls from ports like Alexandria, Tobruk, and later Algiers. Standardized 3-ton and 2.5-ton trucks, designed for desert conditions, delivered daily tonnage over hundreds of kilometers with scheduled maintenance in mobile workshops. These forces showed the advantage of a large, homogeneous truck park and deep fuel stocks, though only at lower force densities than those on the Eastern Front. The comparison filtered back into European staffs. German reports acknowledged that without equivalent truck output and fuel reserves, long-haul motor sustainment at Eastern Front scale was not replicable, reinforcing the decision to keep horses as the backbone of divisional services. Material science entered the adaptation cycle. Rubber scarcity led to increased use of synthetic compounds for tires and to strict mileage accounting. Orders limited non-essential vehicle movement, reassigning liaison and courier duties to motorcycles and bicycles where possible. Air filters were modified with oil bath designs on dusty routes. Engine hours were logged with new rigor. For horses, rations were adjusted seasonally. Veterinary detachments experimented with feed mixtures to maintain weight during sustained marches. Where snow later returned, sledges replaced wheels on some routes, improving traction and reducing axle stress, at the expense of absolute speed. Repair organizations became a decisive variable. German Heereskraft Fahrparks concentrated equipment for engine swaps and gearbox rebuilds, triaging vehicles into quick turn and deep repair lanes. Soviet frontline workshops, supplied through major rail hubs, redistributed serviceable engines across chassis irrespective of original manufacture when compatible. Both sides entrenched the practice of harvesting parts from immobilized vehicles, tracking each donor to minimize waste. The net effect was higher availability at the cost of shrinking total fleet size, a trade judged acceptable while operational density remained high along short sectors. By late summer, the psychological element of adaptation was explicit in orders of the day. March tables emphasized predictability over peak speed. Commanders were instructed to throttle pursuit when fuel columns fell behind schedule. Reports from both sides noted improved survivability of roads where traffic control limited axle loads and enforced intervals, and higher artillery output when ammunition columns received guaranteed night windows. Civilians judged the rhythm by the soundscape of convoys and the timing of ration deliveries. The war of movement had not ended, but its shape was moderated by the learned behavior of armies that now measured ambition against what roads, horses, and trucks could reliably deliver over weeks rather than days. The winter of 1942 to 1943 produced the inflection where transport arithmetic reshaped momentum. On the middle, Volga and Lower Don, formations that had outrun railheads now faced snow, wind, and fuel balances calculated to the day. 6th Army at Stalingrad held a perimeter anchored on factory districts and the riverbank, while relying on road shuttles from depots west of the Don. Bridge and ferry capacity after the summer advance proved insufficient for sustained heavy traffic. When opposing forces cut the land corridor and held the shoulders at Kalach and the Don bends in November, The last-mile system that had fed the perimeter by road collapsed into dependence on airlift. The air fleet available could not offset the missing road and rail tonnage. Daily needs for fuel, ammunition, and rations measured in thousands of tons. Actual deliveries by aircraft seldom reached a fraction of that figure on most days, and winter conditions reduced serviceability for both sides. German attempts to reopen a corridor faced limited motor availability and ice-choked crossings. On the Soviet side, railheads reached the Volga's west bank, and lateral lines fed armies north and south of the city. The road leg from these nodes to front units was short, allowing scheduled truck and sledge convoys to sustain pressure. Farther south, the Caucasus thrust displayed the same mechanism over greater distances. Army Group A advanced toward Maikop, then along the Terek and into the foothills toward Grozny. Permanent bridges over the Kuban and Terek were scarce. Temporary structures imposed axle load limits. Rail conversion lagged by hundreds of kilometers. Daily truck cycles stretched to 400 to 600 kilometers over mountain approaches and steppe roads. Fodder for thousands of draft animals consumed road capacity that might otherwise have carried fuel. Soviet North Caucasus Front moved reserves along interior lines closer to intact rails, and later destroyed bridges to force traffic into narrow mountain corridors. When orders redirected German forces back toward the Don in late 1942, withdrawals required the same constrained crossings, increasing congestion and leaving equipment to be destroyed when recovery resources ran out. The turning point, therefore, appeared not only as battlefield encirclement, but as the moment when distance and node scarcity made road and horse traction unable to support chosen objectives at required density. Resource inflows changed relative capacity. In late 1942 and early 1943, truck deliveries to the Soviet Union increased via the Arctic and the Persian corridor. Standard 2.5-ton trucks and 1.5-ton utility vehicles entered frontline echelons in growing numbers. Their effect was not uniform across all fronts, but where concentration was possible, road legs between railheads and rifle corps shrank in time. Motor columns using standardized spares and fuel cans reduced idle time at depots. This did not eliminate animal traction, which remained significant in short haul and in terrain where wheels failed, but it raised the ceiling on how much tonnage could be moved during windows of fair weather or over frozen ground. By comparison, German motor transport pools shrank under attrition, and replacement output did not match losses. Cannibalization and repair kept runners at the front. But the absolute number of available trucks declined, and tire stocks lagged needs despite careful mileage accounting. At the operational level, this divergence expressed itself as initiative. In November, German High Command committed a relief force towards Stalingrad along the Chir and Akse corridors. Fuel and ammunition reached forward groups in bursts, but the Axis required multiple bridge sites under winter conditions, and the road leg from railheads west of the Don lengthened nightly as rails were repaired only incrementally. On the Soviet side, the encirclement operation combined rail-fed concentrations with short road echelons to shift reserves from one sector to another within days. Artillery ammunition deliveries improved when depots sat within 50 to 80 kilometers of batteries, a range that allowed 1 or 2 truck cycles per day, even in winter with enforced march discipline. The relative reliability of these cycles underwrote counteroffensives that pushed the front back toward the Don in January. The administrative footprint of the turning point was visible in orders and ration scales. German formations imposed stricter limits on non-essential driving and reduced allocations of fuel to headquarters vehicles to preserve supplies for tank and artillery units. Horse teams were reorganized to maintain minimum wagon lift, with some divisions concentrating remaining prime movers in composite columns to guarantee at least one daily run from depots. Ammunition expenditure tables reflected the constraint. Fire plans were adjusted to scheduled arrivals rather than desired rates. Soviet directives in the same period emphasized bridge repair, snow clearance, and the use of sledging routes to equalize supply between sectors. Rail Command concentrated locomotives on corridors supporting offensive groupings. Where road legs exceeded daily cycles, battalions were held back until dumps were established within reach, a practice that avoided the rapid exhaustion of local fuel reserves. Allied theaters reinforced the lesson that standardization and depth mattered. In North Africa, the winter battles of 1942 to 1943 saw long motor hauls from Tripoli and Benghazi for Axis forces and from Algiers and Bonn for Allied forces. The side with greater fuel stock and repair organization could recover tempo after setbacks faster. Reports from these theaters circulated in European staffs and fed planning assumptions for 1943 in the East. German records recognized that without increased truck production and fuel, the Army would continue to depend on horses for divisional services and to accept narrower operational choices in seasons of mud and thaw. Soviet reports highlighted increases in truck availability and planned to exploit shorter road legs near major rail hubs during winter and spring operations. Civilian conditions tracked the shifting balance. In regions near active railheads, food deliveries to towns stabilized, even at low ration scales, as scheduled trains arrived and local truck fleets made short loops to bakeries and hospitals. In areas where rail lines were cut and road legs lengthened, municipal stocks fluctuated sharply. Winter evacuation flows reversed direction when counteroffensives moved the front west. Road and rail assets that had carried factories and families east in 1941 now moved equipment and administrators back toward the Don and the upper Dnieper. For occupied zones, the tightening of German motor resources meant increased requisition of horses and carts, drawing labor and animals from agriculture and depressing local transport capacity for civilian needs. By March 1943, the turning point solidified as armies adjusted to new baselines. German formations retracted to shorter lines with railheads nearer to the front, improving local supply temporarily, but at the cost of relinquishing distant objectives that had depended on long road shuttles. Soviet armies consolidated gains with depots tied directly to rail junctures around Voronezh and Kursk, setting conditions for large summer operations. The transport mix on each side now carried strategic meaning. For Germany, the persistence of horse traction and the shrinking heterogeneous truck park limited options for deep, multi-axis thrusts without months of rail preparation. For the Soviet Union, increasing motorization in forward echelons and the ability to reposition by rail meant greater freedom to choose the time and place of mass, with roads used to complete the last segment rather than to substitute for missing rails over hundreds of kilometers. The turning point therefore rested not only on battlefield encirclement or casualty totals, but on the recalibration of reach. Where earlier offensives had accepted long road legs in expectation of quick decision, subsequent plans tightened the link between rail and road, between available trucks and intended pace. Horses remained fundamental to divisional lift on both sides, yet their role shifted toward predictable short-haul work within stabilized sectors. Trucks became the scarce instrument that determined whether a success could be extended or would culminate. Rail conversion rates, bridge counts, and axle load tables, once background details, now set the limits within which strategy operated. Withdrawal transformed movement from pursuit into preservation. After the winter campaigns of 1942 to 1943, German headquarters issued phased retreat orders that synchronized rearguards, bridge demolitions, and the evacuation of depots. Army Group South crossed to the right bank of the Dnieper in September-October 1943 under elastic defense directives. The schedule placed armored Kampfgruppen at choke points while horse-drawn divisional trains and mixed truck columns lifted ammunition and medical stocks to the next line. Fuel tables shifted sharply. Tank units received priority for rearguard action. Artillery batteries were rationed to time fire plans, and Corps supply officers organized composite motor companies to guarantee at least one round trip per day from temporary dumps to the front. Anything too heavy to recover without all-weather roads, bridge sections, machine tools, immobile guns, was destroyed. Soviet steppe and Voronezh fronts, advancing with railheads approaching the Dnieper, used standardized truck battalions to compress the last leg, where crossings were secured. Pontoon parks and repaired bridges cut cycle times to hours rather than days. The retreat exposed the arithmetic of traction. Horse teams, resilient over broken tracks, could keep moving on poor surfaces, but consume fodder that itself required road lift. Truck companies could move more per axle, but degraded quickly on rutting causeways and corduroy. Corps veterinarians reported rising wastage as marches lengthened. Motor transport parks, already heterogeneous, shrank from losses and cannibalization. To maintain flow, quartermasters consolidated survivors into fewer, larger columns and imposed clock-faced departure slots at ferries and bridge approaches. Soviet armies confronted the inverse problem. Large numbers of standardized 2.5-ton trucks, many newly issued, demanded organized road discipline to avoid congestion at the head of narrow crossings. Bridge classification charts govern the sequence: fuel first, then artillery ammunition, then rations, mirroring German procedures executed in reverse. Urban withdrawals illustrated how roads decided what could be saved. From Smolensk and later from Kiev, evacuations moved in layers: archives and headquarters files by car and motorcycle, hospitals by truck, factory machinery and grain stocks by mixed columns of lorries and horse carts. Night movement reduced air losses but slowed cycles. When weather closed in, sledges replaced wheels on short legs to railheads. On longer legs, fuel consumption spiked as engines idled in queues before temporary bridges. Civilians followed the same axes under civil-military orders. Carts and hand wagons packed approaches to ferries. Municipal authorities issued passes to regulate access, but every hour lost at a crossing translated into abandoned household goods and reduced rations at the next town. On the Soviet side, reoccupation produced a different road picture: rubble clearance, bridge repair, and the reopening of tram lines and municipal trucking restored baseline distribution to bakeries and hospitals within days of rail reconnection. The winter of 1943 to 1944 imposed a second wave of withdrawals on the northern and central sectors. Army Group North pulled from the Emga corridor after the lifting of the Leningrad siege in January. Road options across the Volkhov and Narva sectors were limited. Pioneer battalions rotated pontoons between sites, while rearguard artillery displaced by battery along pre-marked routes. The same divisions that had once advanced behind fuel tankers now rationed tractor use for the heaviest guns, leaving some pieces to be spiked if roads failed. Army Group Center broke under Operation Bagration in June-July 1944. The collapse revealed the dependence of an army on a few nodes. Once rail junctions like Orsha and Bobruisk were cut, truck shuttles extended to 300 kilometers or more over summer dust and torn pavements, and availability fell as engines overheated and filters clogged. Soviet fronts moved with rail repair brigades close behind, bridges replaced by Bailey-type spans, signals restored, and maintained short road legs to rifle corps dumps. The comparative picture was stark, not as judgment, but as distance. One side withdrew across increasing gaps between rail and road. The other advanced with those gaps closing. On the Western Front, Allied landings introduced a different endgame for road logistics. After the Normandy breakout in August 1944, Allied command organized continuous truck shuttles from channel ports to forward depots on the Seine and beyond, routing standardized convoys along one-way circuits to avoid intersections. German withdrawals through the Falaise-Seine line and later from the Scheldt faced limited bridge options and fuel scarcity. Traffic regulators attempted to push mixed horse and motor columns along night routes, while day movement was constrained by air observation. Abandonments multiplied when prime movers ran out of fuel before reaching dismantled crossings. The contrast was institutional rather than moral. Standardized truck fleets with deep fuel stocks sustained long advances. Shrinking mixed fleets under air pressure and with broken bridges struggled to preserve equipment during retreats. By late 1944 in the east, the Dnieper and Vistula lines served as temporary stabilizers. German garrisons held bridgeheads to cover withdrawals, while depots concentrated near the few intact bridges. Heavy traffic produced predictable failures, collapsed abutments, sheared decking, that forced sudden reroutes to ferries. Corps orders scripted detonations for every span with redundant triggers. When executed early, rear guards gained time, but stranded vehicles on the wrong bank. When executed late, columns jammed as demolitions crews waited for the last wagons and tankers to cross. Soviet bridging units rehearsed rapid emplacement and established traffic control detachments with strict axle load enforcement, moving assault guns and ammunition, first to sustain pressure without outrunning road lift. Civilians experienced both systems. On one bank, roadblocks and destruction schedules. On the other, staged openings of crossings to refugee carts after military columns passed. Italy offered a mountain counterpoint. German withdrawals to the Gothic Line in mid-1944 navigated switchbacks and narrow valley floors, where a single-blown culvert halted movement for hours. Horse teams were valuable on mule tracks above the roads, but could not move artillery rapidly. Trucks could sprint across good surfaces, but stalled at every bridge laid over winter torrents. Allied forces, supplied by a mix of rail up the peninsula and motor from ports, shifted pressure laterally when mountain passes clogged. In this environment, the decision to hold or abandon a ridge hinged on whether engineers could keep road loops open behind the crest for nightly resupply. The final campaigns turned roads into corridors of flight as much as supply. In January to April 1945, as Soviet fronts advanced through East Prussia and Pomerania and across the Oder, German authorities organized evacuations of civilians and administrative staffs toward the Baltic ports. The sea lift absorbed what the roads delivered. Carts, trucks, and hand sledges converged on Gotenhafen and Pilau. Bridge losses on the Vistula and Nogat forced detours over winter bridges built on ice. When thaw began, crossing windows narrowed to hours. Rearmies rationed fuel to armored rearguards, while infantry garrisons marched at night to make room for columns on the few all-weather roads. Soviet supply ran on short cycles from Oder railheads to assault armies around Kustrin and later Berlin, using standardized trucks and military police to meter flows into the city blocks. Immediate consequences appeared in inventories and ration scales. Prisoner counts after encirclements in 1944 to 1945 reflected formations cut off from their road base rather than destroyed wholesale in open battle. Artillery parks shrank where tractors could not be spared. Shells stockpiled for fire plans were blown in place when transport failed. Municipal food stocks and retreat zones fluctuated by day. Full shelves when convoys arrived at dawn, then emptier markets for a week if bridges failed that night. In liberated areas, road clearance restored bread distribution within days if rails lay close. Where rails remained distant, trucks ran continuous loops from distant depots, and caloric intake lagged until a spur was reopened. Surrender formalized what the roadmap already showed. Commanders negotiated capitulation sectors by reference to bridges, road forks, and depot locations. Units without fuel marched to assembly areas. Vehicles were drained and parked at verges. Horses led into holding paddocks for redistribution. The same arithmetic governed occupation. Authorities prioritized roads to hospitals, bakeries, and waterworks. Standardized truck fleets under new markings reappeared with scheduled loops. In regions where bridges were down, ferries and temporary spans defined the pace of recovery. The immediate legacy of withdrawal, therefore, was a civilian and military landscape shaped by whether roads had been preserved, whether horses survived to pull the first municipal loads, and whether trucks with interchangeable parts could resume the short-haul cycles that make a city livable. Legacy emerged in the arithmetic that outlived the war. The transport mix that Germany carried into the conflict, limited standardized motor strength alongside a mass of horse traction, fixed the ceiling of operational reach. Encirclements in 1939 to 1941 demonstrated what concentrated trucks and good roads could accomplish over short legs. The culminating battles of 1941 to 1943 showed how pace collapsed when rails trailed the front and road cycles lengthened. Post-war assessments on all sides traced outcomes back to inputs. Truck inventories measured in hundreds of thousands rather than millions. Tire and fuel balances governed by synthetic capacity and Romanian deliveries, and divisional services that consumed fodder tonnage that had to move on the same routes as fuel. Soviet studies highlighted a mirror image: rail density near major cities, growing truck inflows from domestic factories and foreign deliveries on the order of several 100,000 vehicles, and shorter last-mile hauls during counteroffensives raised the sustainable tempo once fronts stabilized near large junctions. Western reports drew an additional comparison to Allied theaters, where standardized 2.5-ton trucks, deep fuel stocks, and one-way convoy circuits sustained long motor hauls from ports to forward depots after 1944. Industrial consequences followed. German recovery organizations kept runners on the road through cannibalization and triage, but each quick repair reduced the total fleet over time. Spare parts dispersion across dozens of makes, introduced by captures after 1940, imposed a maintenance tax that logistics staffs could not entirely offset. Soviet repair parks, supplied by rail from the Volga and Urals, exploited the standardization of new truck series and foreign models to shorten workshop time. The United States and United Kingdom recorded production totals in the millions for trucks and in the tens of millions for tires. Germany recorded lower figures and committed alloy steel and machine hours to aircraft and armored fighting vehicles at the expense of cargo fleets. These were choices inside a resource envelope, not moral categories, but they defined how quickly formations could be recomposed after losses and how far they could be pushed before culminating. Doctrinal lessons codified what practice had taught. Staff colleges after 1945 wrote movement estimates that began with railhead placement and then computed daily truck cycles by distance, surface, axle load, and weather. March tables integrated traffic control, bridge classification, and repair capacity as primary constraints rather than annexes. Horse traction did not disappear immediately. Several European armies retained draft animals for mountain and forestry tasks into the 1950s, and agricultural sectors in Central and Eastern Europe still relied on horses through the early Reconstruction years. Yet the strategic direction was set. New formations in the German Federal Republic formed within NATO, and reorganized Soviet forces within the Warsaw Pact built division and corps services around standardized motor transport. Bridge design, road paving standards, and axle load policy became instruments of national defense planning as much as civil engineering. Infrastructure policy reflected wartime experience. States prioritized hard-surfaced roads along military corridors and near rail junctions. In Western Europe, reconstruction funds restored bridges on primary routes and standardized pavement to support multi-axle trucks. A national interstate program in the United States from the mid-1950s embedded one-way circuits and grade-separated crossings into the peacetime roadmap, making wartime traffic regulation a permanent feature. The Soviet Union expanded paved approaches to major cities and industrial belts, while retaining long distances of gravel and earth in rural regions. Railways remained the backbone, with motor transport assigned to the last segment at scale. These choices affected civil life as much as military planning. Bakery deliveries, hospital supply, and harvest transport followed the same logic of cycle time and axle load. Memory and commemoration framed the transport story unevenly. Public narratives often centered on tanks and aircraft, with roads appearing as scenery and horses disappearing from view. Veterans' manuals, quartermaster reports, and railway records offered a contrasting archive. They enumerated daily fuel issues by unit, tire wastage per 1,000 kilometers, veterinary losses by month, and bridge capacities by class. Historians working from these sources recovered the transport mix that had carried operations. Peaks of motor concentration for spearheads, routine reliance on horse wagons for divisional lift, and a constant negotiation between desired pace and available road cycles. Debates persisted over the counterfactuals, whether more trucks or earlier rail conversion might have changed outcomes on the Central Axis in 1941, or at long range in the Caucasus in 1942. The record shows that increased motor strength without parallel improvements in fuel supply, tire stocks, road surfaces, and bridge counts would have shifted the curve but not removed the constraint. The civilian dimension remained inseparable from the military one. Evacuation schedules, ration scales, and hospital survivability tracked the same variables as core ammunition tables. Where rails reached cities and roads, connected depots to districts in loops measured in hours, caloric intake and medical supply stabilized. Where bridges were down and detours pushed trucks to single-lane causeways, municipal stocks oscillated. Reconstruction turned those wartime lessons into peacetime routines. Priority lanes for emergency services, weight limits on thawing roads, and reserve bridging equipment held by civil works units. The line from wartime march tables to post-war traffic codes was direct. Comparative perspective fixed the legacy within a broader arc. Germany's reliance on horses at division scale and on mixed smaller truck fleets contrasted with the later Allied model of standardized motor mass, and with the Soviet wartime transition to larger truck pools supported by rail. Campaign outcomes correlated with these profiles, whenever distance and weather amplified last-mile costs. In short campaigns on dense networks, Poland 1939, France 1940, concentrated motor transport achieved design tempo. On extended axes with limited hard surfaces and seasonal mud, European US, SR 1941 to 1943, horse traction provided resilience but set a low-speed floor, while the motor park's heterogeneity and fuel limits set a ceiling that operations reached quickly. The historical significance lies in replacing image with measurement. Rail gauge, bridge counts, axle load classes, tire and fuel balances, and animal fodder tonnage are not peripheral details, but the structure that determine pace and reach. The war did not end with a universal model for movement. It ended with differentiated systems tuned to geography and industry. Later decades added new variables: dieselization of railways, containerization, pipeline networks, but the wartime constant remains recognizable. Armies move as far and as fast as the shortest of their linked capacities allows. Rail to road, road to unit, unit to action. In that chain, the proportions of roads, horses, and trucks were not an anecdote. They were the arithmetic that framed strategy, the lived experience of soldiers and civilians, and the lasting map on which post-war states planned both their economies and their defenses.